Sarah Matthews sat in the back corner of Professor Catherine Williams's advanced literature class at Columbia University, her worn notebook filled with passionate annotations about the classic novels they'd been studying all semester. The autumn of 2018 had been particularly challenging for the 22-year-old English major, who worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for her education while maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA. She had dreams that stretched far beyond the cramped studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates in Queens. Dreams of becoming a published author whose words would touch hearts and change lives around the world. Professor Williams, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a perpetual bun, had a reputation for being one of the most demanding instructors in the English department. Her piercing blue eyes seemed to look right through students, and her sharp tongue had reduced many aspiring writers to tears over the years. Sarah had always admired her professor's literary knowledge and critical eye, despite the woman's cold demeanor and tendency to crush students' creative aspirations with brutal honesty. "Miss Matthews!" Professor Williams called out sharply during that fateful Tuesday afternoon, her voice cutting through the classroom like a blade. "Your latest submission shows promise, but let's be realistic here. Writing is not just about passion and pretty words. It requires connections, resources, and frankly, a certain social standing that opens doors." The professor's eyes narrowed as she continued, her words dripping with condescension. "You come from a working-class background, struggle to pay for basic necessities, and have no industry connections whatsoever. You'll fail without help from someone who actually understands how the publishing world operates. Hi there, beautiful souls. I'm Tina, and I'm so grateful you've joined me today for another incredible story that will touch your heart and remind you that our biggest challenges often become our greatest victories. Today, I'm sharing the remarkable journey of a young woman who faced crushing rejection from someone she deeply respected, only to discover that sometimes the people who doubt us the most become the very witnesses to our greatest triumphs. This story will show you how determination, talent, and an unshakable belief in yourself can transform even the most devastating criticism into fuel for extraordinary success. Please hit that like button if you're ready for an inspiring journey, and don't forget to subscribe because I have so many more uplifting stories to share with you. Now, let me tell you about Sarah's incredible transformation. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as 25 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. The professor continued her lecture as if she hadn't just shattered a young woman's confidence, discussing the week's reading assignment with the same detached, academic tone. Sarah's hands trembled as she packed her books, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. She had always known that her background was different from most of her classmates, many of whom came from wealthy families with connections in publishing, media, and academia. But hearing it stated so bluntly, with such casual cruelty, felt like having her deepest fears confirmed by someone whose opinion she had valued above all others. After class, Sarah walked slowly across the campus quad, her mind reeling from the public humiliation. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet as she replayed Professor Williams' words over and over again. Part of her wanted to drop out right then and there, to accept that maybe she was fooling herself about having any real talent or potential for success in the literary world. The practical voice in her head reminded her of the crushing student loan debt she was accumulating, the long hours she worked at the campus bookstore, the coffee shop downtown, and the weekend tutoring job that barely covered her basic expenses. But as Sarah sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, something deeper began to stir within her. She thought about her grandmother, who had immigrated to America with nothing but a suitcase and an unshakable belief in the power of education and hard work. She remembered all the nights she had stayed up writing stories by lamplight, losing herself in worlds she created with nothing but words and imagination. The rejection stung, but it also ignited something fierce and determined in her heart. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She pulled out her laptop and began typing with a fury and focus she had never experienced before. The story that poured out of her was raw, authentic, and deeply personal. It was about a young woman from a working-class family who faced discrimination and doubt from those who were supposed to mentor and guide her. But instead of being defeated by the criticism, the protagonist used it as motivation to prove that talent, determination, and authenticity could triumph over privilege and connections. Night after night, Sarah wrote with passionate intensity, drawing from her own experiences of financial struggle, academic pressure, and the crushing weight of others' expectations. She crafted characters who felt real and flawed, and beautifully human, weaving together themes of class consciousness, educational inequality, and the transformative power of believing in oneself even when no one else does. The story grew into something much larger than she had initially planned, becoming a full-length novel that explored the complex dynamics between teachers and students, the corrupting influence of academic elitism, and the incredible strength that can emerge from the deepest wounds. Sarah's novel began to take shape over the following months, consuming every spare moment she could find between classes, work, and sleep. She wrote during her breaks at the bookstore, crafting dialogue while riding the subway to her tutoring sessions, and developed plot twists during the long hours she spent serving coffee to hurried Manhattan professionals. The story became her sanctuary, a place where she could channel all the pain and frustration of Professor Williams's crushing words into something beautiful and meaningful. Her fingers would tremble slightly each time she opened her laptop, not from nervousness, but from the sheer intensity of emotions that poured onto the screen. Late at night, when the city finally quieted to a gentle hum outside her cramped studio apartment, Sarah would lose herself completely in the world she was creating, tears streaming down her face as she wrote scenes that mirrored her own experiences of feeling small and insignificant in lecture halls, where her voice seemed to disappear among more privileged, confident students. The worn keys of her second-hand laptop became extensions of her soul, each keystroke carrying the weight of her determination to prove that brilliance isn't measured by bank accounts or family connections, but by the raw, honest truth that flows from authentic experience. The protagonist she created was named Elena Rodriguez, a brilliant first-generation college student whose dreams of becoming a writer are nearly destroyed by a professor's cruel assessment of her potential. But Elena refuses to be defined by someone else's limited vision of her future, instead using the rejection as fuel to create the most authentic and powerful story of her generation. Sarah poured her heart into every page, writing with the kind of emotional honesty that can only come from lived experience and genuine struggle. She would often whisper Elena's dialogue aloud as she wrote, testing how the words felt on her tongue, ensuring they carried the weight of truth and resilience. "I won't let your narrow vision become my reality," Elena declares to her fictional professor in one particularly powerful scene. And Sarah felt those words healing something broken inside herself as she typed them. Sometimes she would catch herself crying as she wrote, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally giving voice to feelings she had carried in silence for so long. As winter turned to spring, Sarah's novel evolved into something extraordinary. She had created a narrative that was both deeply personal and universally relatable, exploring themes that resonated with anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed because of their background. The book dealt with issues of class inequality in higher education, the way systemic barriers can masquerade as merit-based assessments, and the incredible power of authentic storytelling to bridge divides between different worlds. During her research, Sarah interviewed dozens of first-generation college students, documenting their struggles with imposter syndrome and the subtle ways academic environments could make them feel like outsiders. These conversations left her both heartbroken and inspired, knowing that Elena's story would speak for so many silenced voices. Each interview revealed new layers of shared experience, from the shame of wearing discount store clothes to campus events, to the exhaustion of working multiple jobs while classmates complained about their unpaid internships. Sarah's writing process was meticulous and passionate. She researched publishing industry practices, studied the work of authors who had broken barriers and challenged traditional gatekeepers, and refined her prose with the same dedication she brought to her academic studies. She joined online writing communities where she connected with other aspiring authors from diverse backgrounds, many of whom had faced similar dismissals and discouragements from professors and industry, professionals who couldn't see past their own privilege and assumptions. These relationships became lifelines during moments of doubt, when the familiar voice of Professor Williams would echo in her mind, whispering that she was deluding herself about her abilities. Her small apartment transformed into a writer's haven, with index cards pinned to walls mapping character arcs and plot developments, empty coffee cups stacked like monuments to her late-night dedication, and printed pages covered in red ink corrections scattered across every surface. The novel's central message emerged clearly as Sarah continued writing, that real literary talent isn't determined by social connections or family wealth, but by the ability to tell authentic stories that speak to the human experience in all its complexity and beauty. Elena's journey from rejected student to successful author became a metaphor for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or connected enough to achieve their dreams. By the spring of 2019, Sarah had completed her first draft. The manuscript was 320 pages of raw emotional truth, compelling characters, and a plot that built to a satisfying climax, where Elena not only achieves publishing success, but does so with a story that directly challenges the kind of academic elitism that had nearly destroyed her confidence. Sarah spent the summer revising and polishing, working with a writing group she had joined and incorporating feedback from trusted friends who understood her vision. You know, dear friends, I have to pause here for a moment because this story touches something so deep in my heart. How many of us have been told we're not good enough, that we don't have what it takes, that our dreams are too big for our circumstances? I want you to know that if you're watching this and you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated, you're not alone. Your voice matters, your story deserves to be told, and your dreams are valid. Regardless of what anyone else might say, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because I believe in sharing stories that remind us all of our incredible potential. And in the comments below, I'd love to hear about a time when someone doubted you, but you proved them wrong, or share what dreams you're still fighting for. Your story could inspire someone else who's struggling today. The submission process proved to be its own grueling journey, one that tested every fiber of Sarah's resolve while simultaneously strengthening her character in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sarah spent countless hours researching literary agents, her laptop screen glowing late into the night as she scrolled through agency websites, reading client lists and submission guidelines with the intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important exam of her life. She crafted personalized query letters with meticulous care, tailoring each one to specific agents while maintaining the authentic voice that made her story unique. The process of sending her manuscript to dozens of publishing professionals became a ritual of hope and vulnerability, each submission representing another chance to prove that her story deserved to be heard by the world. Her fingers would tremble slightly as she clicked send, and she would whisper a small prayer to the universe, hoping that somewhere out there, an agent would see what Professor Williams had failed to recognize. Sometimes she would sit in her cramped apartment kitchen afterward, nursing a cup of cold coffee while staring out the window at the city lights, wondering if her words were floating somewhere in the digital ether, waiting to find their perfect match. The silence that followed each submission was deafening, a void filled only by her own anxious heartbeat and the constant checking of her email inbox. The rejection letters came steadily, arriving in her inbox like clockwork, each one a small sting that she had learned to expect, but that still hurt nonetheless. Her heart would sink every time she saw those familiar subject lines. Your query, or thank you for your submission. The form letters were almost worse than personal rejections because of their impersonal nature. Not quite right for our list, they would say with cold professionalism, or while the writing shows promise, we don't see a clear market for this story. Some agents didn't respond at all, leaving Sarah to wonder if her Carefully crafted emails had disappeared into the digital void, her dreams dissolving somewhere in cyberspace. During particularly difficult days, she would find herself staring at her computer screen, tears blurring her vision as she read yet another polite dismissal. Maybe Professor Williams was right, she would think in her darkest moments, her inner critic echoing those harsh words from years ago. She would close her laptop with a heavy sigh, walk to her small balcony, and let the cool, evening air wash over her face while she reminded herself that every successful author had faced this same wall of rejection. But Sarah had learned something powerful from Professor Williams' cruel assessment, a lesson that had transformed her relationship with failure and rejection entirely. Rejection was just information, not a final verdict on her worth or potential as a writer or human being. Each no brought her closer to the eventual yes, and she continued refining her query letter with the precision of a craftsman, adjusting her approach based on feedback when it was offered, and researching new agents who might be a better fit for her story and her vision. She studied successful debut novels by authors from diverse backgrounds, noting how they had navigated the publishing landscape and found their audiences despite facing similar barriers and challenges. Her mother would call during these marathon research sessions, offering words of encouragement that had become her lifeline. "Mija, your voice matters," she would say softly in Spanish, her accent thick with emotion. "Don't let anyone tell you different. Your story will find its way to the people who need to hear it." These conversations became Sarah's anchor, grounding her when the waves of doubt threatened to pull her under, reminding her that her experiences and perspectives had value beyond what any professor or rejection letter might suggest. In August 2019, Sarah received an email that would change everything, arriving on a humid Tuesday morning that would forever be etched in her memory. Literary agent Marcus Chen from the prestigious Harrison Literary Agency had read her full manuscript and wanted to schedule a phone call to discuss representation. Sarah's hands shook as she read his message, which praised the authenticity of her voice and the compelling nature of her protagonist's journey with an enthusiasm that felt genuine and deeply understanding. "This is exactly the kind of story the industry needs right now," he wrote with conviction that leaped off the screen. "Elena's struggle is both deeply personal and broadly resonant, and I believe this book has the potential to reach a wide audience hungry for authentic voices and real stories." She had to read the email 3 times before the words truly sank in, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She called her mother immediately, her voice breaking with joy and disbelief. "Mama, someone believes in my story," she sobbed into the phone. "Someone finally sees what I've been trying to say all these years." Her mother's joyful cries echoed through the phone, and Sarah could hear her father's voice in the background asking what was happening, followed by excited chatter in Spanish as the news spread through her family like wildfire. The phone conversation with Marcus exceeded Sarah's wildest expectations, lasting nearly 2 hours as they discussed her vision, her goals, and the broader implications of her story in today's literary landscape. He understood her vision completely, recognizing the layered social commentary woven throughout the narrative, and had specific, actionable ideas about how to position the book for maximum impact in a competitive marketplace. His genuine excitement about her work was infectious, and for the first time since beginning this journey, Sarah felt truly understood and valued as an artist. Within 2 weeks, he had prepared a detailed submission, strategy, and began sending the manuscript to editors at major publishing houses, each carefully selected for their commitment to diverse voices and meaningful storytelling. Against All Odds was published in March 2020, just as the world was beginning to grapple with unprecedented challenges that would reshape society's understanding of inequality and opportunity. The timing proved to be serendipitous, as readers everywhere were questioning established systems and seeking stories that spoke to themes of resilience, authenticity, and the power of individual determination to overcome structural barriers. Sarah remembered the exact moment she held her first copy, sitting in her cramped apartment as rain drummed against the windows like a gentle applause from the universe itself. The weight of the book in her hands felt heavier than its actual mass, carrying years of late nights, rejection letters, and the persistent echo of Professor Williams' dismissive words that had once threatened to shatter her dreams completely. She ran her fingers across the cover, feeling the raised letters of her name beneath the title, and whispered to herself with tears streaming down her cheeks, "I did it. Despite everything, despite everyone who said I couldn't, I actually did it." The words tasted like victory mixed with vindication, sweet and overwhelming. The book's release strategy included a carefully planned media tour, but the pandemic forced everything to shift to virtual events. Sarah found herself doing interviews from her small apartment, the same space where she had written late into the night while working multiple jobs to pay for her education. The contrast wasn't lost on her or her audience, and her humble beginnings became part of the story that readers found so compelling. During one particularly memorable interview with NPR, the host commented on the authenticity that radiated from her modest backdrop. "There's something powerful about seeing you in the space where this book was born," he said. "It reminds us that great art doesn't require perfect conditions, just persistent dedication." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the nights she'd written by the light of a single lamp, her neighbors' arguments filtering through thin walls, creating a symphony of real life that had somehow found its way into her prose. The first major review appeared in the New York Times Book Review, written by acclaimed critic Michael Davidson. Sarah Matthews has crafted a debut novel that feels both urgently contemporary and timelessly relevant, he wrote. Her protagonist, Elena Rodriguez, represents the countless talented individuals whose voices have been marginalized by systems that privilege connections over creativity, wealth over wisdom. This is essential reading for anyone who has ever been underestimated. When Sarah read those words for the first time, she had to set the newspaper down and walk to her window, looking out at the bustling street below. Strangers were walking past, each carrying their own stories of struggle and triumph, and she realized that her individual victory had somehow become part of something much larger than herself. Sales numbers exceeded everyone's expectations. Within the first month, Against All Odds had sold over 50,000 copies and was being picked up by book clubs across the country. The story resonated particularly strongly with first-generation college students, working-class readers, and anyone who had faced dismissal or discrimination in academic or professional settings. Social media buzzed with readers sharing their own stories of overcoming doubt and proving their critics wrong. Sarah's book tour, conducted entirely through virtual events, connected her with audiences she might never have reached through traditional in-person appearances. Libraries, bookstores, universities, and community centers hosted online discussions where Sarah spoke about her writing process, her inspiration, and the broader themes of educational equity and social mobility that ran throughout her novel. Each event drew hundreds of participants, many of whom shared emotional testimonials about how Elena's story had inspired them to pursue their own dreams. The success of her debut novel brought opportunities that Sarah had never imagined possible. She was invited to speak at writers' conferences, contribute essays to literary magazines, and participate in panel discussions about diversity in publishing. Magazine profiles appeared in major publications, chronicling her journey from struggling student to celebrated author and examining the broader issues her book had brought to light. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her readers themselves. Social media posts poured in from people who had been inspired to pursue their own creative dreams, return to school, or simply believe in themselves more fully after reading Elena's story. Teachers reached out to share how they were using the book to discuss themes of equity and inclusion with their students. Libraries reported that it was one of their most requested titles, with waiting lists that stretched for months. The financial success of her novel allowed Sarah to pay off her student loans completely, move to a larger apartment in Brooklyn, and focus entirely on her writing career. But the money, while life-changing, wasn't what mattered most to her. What truly filled her with pride and purpose was knowing that her story had made a difference in people's lives, that her authentic voice had found its audience and was inspiring others to believe in their own potential. As summer approached, Sarah received a call that would bring her story full circle in the most unexpected way. Professor Catherine Williams had somehow obtained her publisher's contact information and left a message requesting a meeting. The woman who had so cruelly dismissed Sarah's potential 2 years earlier wanted to discuss something important, though she hadn't been specific about the nature of their proposed conversation. Sarah agreed to meet, curious about what her former professor might want to discuss. They arranged to have coffee at a small cafe near Columbia's campus, the same neighborhood where Sarah had once walked in devastation after being told she would never succeed as a writer. The irony of returning to that space as a best-selling author wasn't lost on her, but she approached the meeting with genuine openness rather than a desire for vindication or revenge. The coffee shop on Broadway near Columbia University was bustling with the familiar energy of academic life when Sarah arrived for her meeting with Professor Williams. She had chosen a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, wanting to look professional but not ostentatious. As she scanned the room, she spotted her former professor sitting at a corner table, looking older and somewhat more fragile than Sarah remembered. Professor Williams' usual stern expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty, and she stood awkwardly when Sarah approached, her movements hesitant and uncharacteristically clumsy. The harsh fluorescent lighting seemed to highlight every new wrinkle etched into the professor's face, each line a testament to sleepless nights and growing doubt about her legacy as an educator who had perhaps done more harm than good. "Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me," Professor Williams said, her voice lacking the commanding authority that had once intimidated entire classrooms. "I wasn't sure you would want to see me after everything that happened." There was a vulnerability in her tone that Sarah had never heard before, and it caught her off guard. The woman who had once seemed so confident in her harsh judgments now appeared genuinely nervous about this encounter, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of her coffee cup while her eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape. From the weight of this long overdue conversation, her voice cracked slightly on the word everything, revealing the depth of regret she carried for that devastating day when she had so carelessly dismissed Sarah's dreams with a few cutting words. Sarah settled into her chair and ordered a simple coffee, studying her former professor's face for clues about what this meeting might entail. Professor Williams looked tired, and there were new lines around her eyes that spoke of stress or sleepless nights. She clutched a worn copy of Against All Odds in her hands, the pages clearly having been read and reread multiple times with numerous bookmarks and sticky notes protruding from various sections. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the weight of unspoken history and the lingering echo of harsh words spoken 2 years prior. Sarah could smell the faint scent of her professor's familiar perfume, mixed with the rich aroma of coffee beans, a combination that transported her instantly back to those classroom days when she had felt so small and uncertain about her place in the world of literature. The afternoon light filtering through the coffee shop windows cast long shadows across the table, creating an almost confessional atmosphere that seemed perfectly suited for the difficult conversation that was about to unfold between them. "I've been reading your novel," Professor Williams began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've actually read it 3 times now, and each time I discover something new that impresses me, something that makes me realize just how wrong I was about your potential." She paused, seeming to struggle with words that clearly didn't come easily. "Sarah, I need to apologize to you. What I said in class that day was not only unprofessional and cruel, it was fundamentally wrong in every possible way." The professor's fingers traced the edges of the book's cover nervously, and Sarah noticed how her once perfectly manicured nails were now bitten down to the quick, a sign of anxiety that seemed completely at odds with the composed woman she remembered. Her voice broke completely as she whispered, "I've carried the shame of that moment every single day since it happened." The professor opened Sarah's book to a page she had clearly marked, and Sarah could see handwritten notes in the margins. This character, Elena, her professor's treatment of her, the way she uses that rejection as motivation to prove herself. It's all so authentic and powerful. I recognized myself in Professor Martinez immediately, and I was horrified by what I saw reflected back at me. Professor Williams' hands shook slightly as she turned the pages. I realized that I had become exactly the kind of gatekeeper that literature doesn't need, someone who judges potential based on background rather than talent. Sarah listened carefully, processing the emotions she felt watching this woman who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating, now appearing vulnerable and regretful. There was no satisfaction in seeing Professor Williams's distress, only a kind of sad recognition of how easy it is for people in positions of authority to wield that power carelessly and cause lasting damage. But there was also something healing about finally hearing the acknowledgement she had needed 2 years earlier. Your book has been assigned reading in 3 of my courses this semester, Professor Williams continued. My students are engaging with themes of educational equity and authentic voice in ways that are transforming our classroom discussions. Several students from working-class backgrounds have told me that Elena's story gave them permission to write about their own experiences, to see their perspectives as valuable rather than limitations to overcome. As their conversation continued, Professor Williams revealed something that surprised Sarah even more than her apology. She had been struggling with her own sense of purpose as an educator, questioning whether her traditional approaches were actually serving her students or simply perpetuating systems that favored those who already had advantages. Reading Sarah's novel had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own biases and teaching methods. Dear friends, I have to pause here because this moment in Sarah's story touches something so profound about forgiveness and growth. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most become the very ones who help us understand our own strength and resilience. If you're still with me on this incredible journey, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced a moment where someone who doubted you later recognized your worth. These stories of transformation and redemption remind us that we all have the capacity to grow, change, and become better versions of ourselves. Your engagement means the world to me, and I love hearing about your own experiences with overcoming challenges and finding your authentic voice. Professor Williams reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder filled with what appeared to be correspondence and documents. Sarah, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that might explain why your book has had such a profound impact on me personally. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. She opened the folder and showed Sarah a collection of rejection letters, editorial feedback, and manuscript pages that were clearly decades old, the edges worn from years of handling. I was once a struggling writer myself, long before I became a professor. I faced many of the same rejections and dismissals that you did, but I let them defeat me instead of using them as motivation. The admission hung between them like a confession that had been buried too long under layers of professional authority and academic pretense. The revelation was stunning. Professor Williams had been working on a novel about her grandmother's immigration experience, pouring her heart into a story about resilience and hope in the face of overwhelming obstacles. But after facing a series of rejections from agents and publishers, many of which questioned whether there was a market for immigrant stories or suggested that her working-class background made her an unlikely literary success, she had abandoned her writing dreams entirely and retreated into the safety of academia. I kept every single rejection letter, she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of accumulated disappointment. I told myself I was keeping them as motivation, but really they became evidence of my inadequacy. Each no felt like confirmation that I didn't belong in the world I desperately wanted to enter. When I saw you in my classroom, so passionate about your writing, so determined despite your financial struggles, I think I saw my younger self, Professor Williams explained, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Instead of encouraging you, I projected my own fears and failures onto you. I told you that you would fail because I had failed, and I couldn't bear to watch another person from a similar background go through what I had experienced. She pressed her lips together, fighting back decades of suppressed emotion. I thought I was being realistic, preparing you for disappointment. but I was really just passing on the wounds that had never properly healed. I was so afraid of seeing you get crushed the way I had been that I tried to crush your dreams first, thinking somehow that would hurt less. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her as she processed this revelation. There was compassion for the young woman Professor Williams had been, full of dreams that had been crushed by a system that didn't value diverse voices. But there was also sadness that her professor's response to her own disappointment had been to try to protect others by discouraging them rather than fighting to change the system that had rejected them both. "I understand why you did it," Sarah said softly, reaching across the table to touch the older woman's hand. "Pain makes us do things that don't make sense to anyone else. You were trying to save me from what you went through, even if it came out wrong." She could see the guilt and regret written in every line of Professor Williams' face, the burden of carrying both her own dreams and the fear that she had destroyed someone else's. "Your success has shown me something I had forgotten," Professor Williams continued, pulling out more documents from her folder with shaking hands. "These are the chapters I wrote 30 years ago, stored away in a closet because I was too ashamed and disappointed to look at them. After reading your novel, I finally had the courage to read my own work again. Sarah, I think my story might still be worth telling, even after all these years." The pages she revealed were filled with careful handwriting, corrections in the margins, and the unmistakable passion of someone who had believed deeply in their story. "Reading your book didn't just make me proud of you. It made me remember who I used to be before I let fear win. It reminded me that stories about people like us, people who weren't born into literary families or Ivy League schools, matter just as much as any other story ever written." The older woman's manuscript pages were yellowed with age but filled with beautiful prose about her grandmother's journey from Poland to New York, the sacrifices made for future generations, and the complex identity struggles faced by first-generation Americans. The writing was sophisticated and emotionally resonant, clearly the work of someone with genuine talent who had simply been discouraged by a publishing industry that wasn't ready for diverse voices 3 decades earlier. Sarah found herself completely absorbed in the fragments she could see, drawn in by the authentic voice and compelling characters that emerged even from these aged, incomplete pages. "Professor Williams, this is beautiful," she breathed, looking up with genuine amazement. "The way you capture your grandmother's voice, the details about immigrant life. This is exactly the kind of story the world needs to hear. This isn't just good writing, it's important writing." "Would you consider reading what I wrote?" Professor Williams asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask for your help after how I treated you, but your book has inspired me to believe that maybe it's not too late for second chances. The publishing world has changed so much since I was trying to break in, and stories like mine and yours are finally being recognized as valuable." She gathered the pages protectively against her chest, as if they were precious artifacts that might crumble if handled too roughly. "I've been carrying this manuscript with me for weeks now, ever since I finished reading your novel. Part of me thought about throwing it away again, convinced that the moment for telling this story had passed forever. But seeing what you accomplished, seeing how you turned rejection into determination, made me realize that maybe giving up was the real failure, not the rejections themselves." Sarah looked at the vulnerable woman sitting across from her, no longer the intimidating professor who had once seemed so certain about who deserved success and who didn't. She saw instead a fellow writer who had been wounded by rejection and had spent decades healing from that pain in all the wrong ways. There was something beautiful about the possibility of transformation and redemption that this moment represented. "Professor Williams, or should I call you Margaret now, what you're showing me takes incredible courage. Most people would have thrown those pages away years ago and never looked back. The fact that you kept them, even when they caused you pain, tells me that part of you always knew your story deserved to be told." She leaned forward, her own eyes bright with excitement. The publishing industry today is actively seeking authentic voices, stories that reflect the real diversity of human experience. What seemed impossible 30 years ago might not only be possible now, it might be exactly what readers are hungry for. I would be honored to read your work, Sarah said gently, her voice filled with genuine warmth and respect. And if you decide you want to try to get it published, I'd be happy to put you in touch with my agent. The industry really has changed, and there's finally space for the kinds of authentic stories that were overlooked for too long. She paused, looking at the manuscript pages with genuine interest and growing excitement. Your grandmother's story deserves to be told, and your voice deserves to be heard. But more than that, I think you have something powerful to say about resilience, about what it means to reclaim dreams that we thought were lost forever. There's a whole generation of readers who need to hear that it's never too late to pursue what matters to you. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. The student who had once been told she would fail was now encouraging her former professor to pursue the very dreams she had abandoned out of fear. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Professor Williams made one more surprising request that seemed to crystallize the complete transformation of their relationship. She wanted to invite Sarah back to speak to her advanced literature students, not as a guest lecturer, but as a successful author whose journey could inspire the next generation of diverse writers. She had redesigned her curriculum to focus more heavily on contemporary voices and authentic storytelling, using Sarah's novel as a central text in discussions about literature's power to challenge social barriers. I want them to see what's possible, she explained, her voice stronger now than it had been all afternoon. I want them to meet someone who refused to let other people's limitations become their own. I spent so many years teaching students to be realistic about their chances instead of teaching them to be resilient in the face of obstacles. I want to change that starting now. The invitation felt like more than just a speaking engagement. It was a public acknowledgement of her mistake and a commitment to doing better by future students who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. The transformation of their relationship from antagonistic to collaborative felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with cruelty and evolved into mutual respect and understanding. Sarah agreed to speak to the class, seeing it as an opportunity to encourage other students who might be facing the same doubts and discouragements she had once experienced. But she also saw it as a chance to witness Professor Williams' own journey of redemption, to see her former teacher embrace the role of encourager rather than discourager. I think what you're doing takes more courage than writing a book, Sarah told her as they gathered their things. It's one thing to put your story on paper. It's another thing entirely to admit you were wrong and work to make things right. Your students are lucky to have a professor who's willing to grow and change, even after all these years. As they walked out into the afternoon sunshine, both women carried with them the weight of stories yet to be told and the hope that it was never too late to begin again. Sarah's return to Professor Williams' classroom 6 months later was a moment of profound personal triumph, but it was also something much more meaningful than simple vindication. She stood before 30 eager students, many of whom reminded her of her younger self with their worn notebooks, second-hand textbooks, and eyes full of dreams that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. The classroom that had once been the site of her deepest humiliation had been transformed into a space of encouragement and possibility. The afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns across desks where young writers scribbled notes with the same desperate intensity she remembered from her own student days. Her heart raced as she recognized the familiar mixture of hope and terror in their faces, remembering how it felt to believe your entire future depended on whether someone else could see the worth in your words. When I sat in these same seats just 2 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and warm despite the tremor of emotion she felt building in her chest, I thought that my background, my financial situation, and my lack of connections meant that my writing dreams were unrealistic. Professor Williams told me something that day that initially devastated me, but ultimately became the catalyst for everything I've achieved since then. She looked over at Professor Williams, who was sitting quietly in the back corner, nodding encouragingly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears of pride and regret. The weight of their shared history hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and transformative. The students listened with rapt attention as Sarah shared her story of rejection, determination, and eventual success. But more importantly, she talked about the broader lessons she had learned about authentic storytelling, the value of diverse voices in literature, and the importance of believing in your own worth even when others can't see your potential. Several students asked questions about the publishing process, the challenges of writing while working multiple jobs, and how to handle rejection and criticism. Their questions came rapidly, desperately, as if they feared this moment of connection might disappear if they didn't capture every piece of wisdom being offered. One student, a young man named David Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan, raised his hand nervously. "I've been told that my stories about my family's experience aren't universal enough for mainstream audiences. How do you respond when people say your background limits your appeal as a writer?" The question clearly came from personal pain, and Sarah could see the familiar struggle between hope and doubt playing out in his expression. His voice cracked slightly on the word universal, and Sarah felt her own throat tighten with recognition of that particular wound. Sarah's response drew from everything she had learned through her own journey. David, the most universal stories are often the most specific ones. When you write authentically about your family's experience, you're tapping into themes of love, sacrifice, identity, and belonging that resonate with everyone, regardless of their background. The publishing industry is finally beginning to understand that diverse stories don't limit audiences. They expand them. She watched his shoulders straighten slightly, saw hope kindle in his dark eyes like a flame being carefully nursed back to life. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by numerous students who wanted to share their own writing and ask for advice about pursuing publication. She exchanged contact information with several promising young writers, offering to read their work and provide feedback when possible. The sense of community and mutual support in the room was everything she had once hoped to find in academic spaces. Their eager faces clustered around her like flowers turning towards sunlight, and she felt the profound responsibility and joy of being someone who could offer encouragement instead of discouragement. Professor Williams approached as the classroom emptied, carrying a manila envelope that Sarah recognized as containing her grandmother's manuscript. "I wanted you to be the first to know," she said with a shy smile that reminded Sarah of her own student's tentative hope. "Marcus Chen agreed to represent my novel, and we have our first editor meeting scheduled for next week. After 30 years, I'm going to be a published author, and it's all because your courage inspired me to find my own." Her voice wavered with decades of suppressed dreams finally being allowed to breathe. The two women embraced, and Sarah felt the final healing of wounds that had shaped both of their journeys in unexpected ways. Professor Williams had become not just an apologetic colleague, but a genuine friend and fellow writer who understood the challenges they had both faced and overcome. The hug lasted longer than either had expected, carrying within it all the words of apology and forgiveness that had already been spoken, all the shared understanding of what it meant to risk everything for the sake of a story that demanded to be told. 6 months later, both women were celebrating book launches within the same month. Professor Williams' novel, Threads of Memory, An Immigrant's Daughter's Journey, received starred reviews and was selected as a finalist for the National Book Award. Sarah's second novel, Rising Voices, Stories of Resilience, became an immediate bestseller and was optioned for film adaptation by a major Hollywood studio. The literary world seemed to have opened its arms to embrace the very voices it had once dismissed, as if the universe itself was correcting an ancient imbalance. At the joint book launch event they held at Columbia University's main library, Sarah looked out at the audience of students, faculty, readers, and aspiring writers who had come to celebrate both novels. She thought about the girl who had once left this campus in tears, convinced that her dreams were impossible, and marveled at how pain could be transformed into purpose when met with determination and authentic self-expression. The grand reading room buzzed with conversation and laughter, the sound of dreams being shared and celebrated rather than crushed under the weight of someone else's limited imagination. "Sometimes," Sarah told the audience that evening, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed library, The people who tell us we'll fail without help are actually showing us that we have everything we need to succeed within ourselves. Professor Williams and I both discovered that our voices were not limitations to overcome, but gifts to be shared with the world. We found our help in each other, in our communities, and most importantly, in our willingness to believe in our own stories even when no one else could see their value. The words felt like a benediction, a blessing offered to every person who had ever been told their dreams were too big or their voice too small. The applause that filled the library that night was for more than just 2 successful books. It was recognition of the power of transformation, the importance of second chances, and the incredible strength that can emerge when we refuse to let other people's limited vision define our potential. Sarah Matthews, once told she would fail without help, had discovered that the most powerful help of all comes from believing in yourself and finding the courage to prove that authentic voices deserve to be heard.